Welcome. In the shadow of a towering golden statue on the plain of Dura, three young men made a choice that defied the most powerful king of their time. The command was simple and deadly: bow when the music plays or burn in the furnace. Most knelt. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood firm. Their story reaches you tonight with fresh relevance. When pressure to compromise rises in your own life, their example shows the strength found in quiet trust in God. Settle in and let these words guide you into rest. We open with this powerful account from Daniel chapter 3 because it captures attention immediately and holds it through every detail. The events unfold in ancient Babylon under King Nebuchadnezzar. A massive image, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, stands gleaming. Officials from across the empire gather for its dedication. A herald proclaims, "As soon as the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music sound, everyone must fall down and worship." Refusal means instant death in a blazing furnace. The music begins. Crowds lower to the ground, but three men remain standing. Accusation reaches the king. Fury follows. The furnace heats 7 times hotter. Soldiers bind the three in their robes and cast them into the flames. Yet inside the fire, they walk unharmed with a fourth figure beside them. They emerge without singe, without smoke. The king praises their God and promotes them. This is no distant legend. It is the lived experience of young exiles who chose faithfulness over safety. Taken from Judah, trained in Babylonian ways, they had already resolved to honor God in daily matters. Now the test intensified. Their response to the king carries calm conviction. Our God is able to deliver us. But even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the image. Their stand was not impulsive. It grew from consistent obedience in the king's court. They supported one another. They trusted God's power and his wisdom. In a world demanding conformity, they remained distinct. Their courage came from knowing the God who sees, who accompanies, and who delivers according to his purposes. The plain of Dura stretched wide and flat under the Babylonian sun, and on that plain stood something that had not been there before. Nebuchadnezzar had built his image of gold, 60 cubits high, 6 cubits wide, and set it where all could see it, and none could miss its meaning. It gleamed in the morning light like a second sun, visible from a great distance, casting its long shadow across the assembled officials of the empire. Satraps and prefects and governors and advisors had come from every province, summoned by royal command, dressed in their finest robes, standing in their appointed places beneath that golden shadow. The king had built many things. He had built walls that astonished the world, and hanging gardens that defied explanation, and palaces that made visitors fall silent with their grandeur. But this image was different. This was not a monument to Babylonian engineering. This was a test. The herald's voice rang out across the plain with the clarity of a man who understood the weight of what he was announcing. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. The words settled over the assembly like a second shadow. No one spoke. The furnace was not a rumor. It was there, visible, already breathing heat into the morning air. The king's meaning was not ambiguous. Compliance was survival. Resistance was death. The mathematics were simple. Then the music began. It rose across the plain of Dura, horn and flute and zither and lyre, all the instruments together, filling the air with a sound that was simultaneously beautiful and commanding. And as one, the nations fell. Every provincial official, every representative of every people and language under Nebuchadnezzar's hand, went down to the ground before the image of gold. Everyone except three. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been given their Babylonian names in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar, had learned the language and the literature of their captors, had served with such distinction that the king himself had appointed them to administrative positions over the affairs of the province. They were, by every visible measure, men who had found a way to survive exile with their lives and their careers intact. But there were things they had not surrendered with their names. When the music rose and the thousands around them went to the ground, the three men remained standing. Not defiantly, not with arms raised or voices raised in protest, simply standing, still and upright, in a sea of prostrate bodies, as visible as trees left standing after a flood. They did not need to announce their refusal. Their standing announced it for them. The astrologers saw. Of course they saw. They had been watching, perhaps waiting, for exactly this. There was political calculation in their accusation, the particular eagerness of men who have noted the advancement of foreigners above their own kind and have been waiting for a reason to speak. They came to the king with their report dressed in the language of loyalty. There are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. The accusation landed with precision. The king who had promoted these men now heard that they had publicly refused him before the entire assembled court of the empire. Nebuchadnezzar's fury was immediate and personal. He had not merely been disobeyed, he had been humiliated before the eyes of his officials, his authority openly contradicted by three men whose positions he himself had granted. He ordered them brought before him, and in the bringing of them there was still the faint possibility of resolution, still the chance that when they stood before the full weight of royal power and looked at the furnace that was already burning, they would find within themselves the practical wisdom to comply. He gave them the opportunity. He was not, at this moment, without a kind of rough mercy. He repeated the command and its consequence, gave them the music and the choice again, and asked them plainly, "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" It was a reasonable question by the logic of the ancient world. The gods of the nations had been measured against the gods of Babylon and found wanting. Nebuchadnezzar had seen it. His armies had demonstrated it across the known world. The God of these three Jewish administrators had not prevented the fall of Jerusalem or the exile of his people. What evidence was there that he would intervene now against the most powerful king on earth, in the most powerful empire in the world, beside a furnace already heated and waiting? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not ask for time to deliberate. They did not look at each other for reassurance, or lower their voices, or choose their words with the careful diplomacy of men trying to survive a dangerous audience. They answered with the particular calm of people who had already settled the question before the question was asked. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. What followed was not defiance, it was declaration, the simple, clear articulation of what they knew and what they had decided. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. They believed it. This was not rhetoric. They were standing beside the furnace, and they believed that the God who had made the world had not lost track of them in Babylon. But then came the 4 words that reveal the full depth of what they had settled in themselves long before this moment. The words that make this not merely a story of faith rewarded, but of faith that does not require reward to remain faith. But even if he does not, here was the thing. They were not bargaining with God. They were not presenting their faithfulness as a claim against his deliverance, as though they had earned a rescue by their obedience. They understood something that is very difficult to understand from a comfortable distance, that God's goodness does not depend on his visible intervention, and that a faith which only holds in the moments when God performs according to expectation is not really faith at all. Even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. The king's face changed. Whatever faint possibility of resolution had remained was gone. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than its ordinary temperature, an act that was partly rage and partly something stranger, perhaps the instinct of a man who does not fully understand what he is dealing with and believes that more heat will settle the matter. The strongest soldiers in his army bound the 3 men and carried them to the mouth of the furnace. The heat killed the soldiers. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the fire. What happened next made the king of Babylon rise from his throne. He had been watching, as kings watch executions, with the satisfied attention of power that has been challenged and answered the challenge. And then he stopped watching the way a man watches something expected and began watching the way a man watches something impossible. He leaned forward. He asked his advisors the question that his own eyes had already answered. Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? Certainly, your majesty. Look, look. It is such a simple word for such an extraordinary thing. 4 men walking in the fire. Walking, not writhing, not fallen, not being consumed. Walking, as one walks in a garden on a pleasant morning, unbound, unhurried, unharmed. And the 4th was different. The king searched for language and found only this. He looks like a son of the gods. He approached the mouth of the furnace and called out to them by name. Servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. And they came out. The officials who had prostrated themselves before the golden image pressed forward now to look at these 3 men who had stood when everyone else fell, who had gone into fire and come out of it, as though fire were merely a room they had passed through. They examined them with the thoroughness of witnesses who understood that what they were seeing would be told and retold across the provinces for generations. Not a hair was singed, not a robe was scorched, not the faint ghost of smoke clung to their clothing. The fire had touched the ropes that bound them. They were gone, but nothing else. nothing. The men who had been thrown into the blazing furnace stood before the court of Babylon, looking exactly as they had looked when they were thrown in, except that they were no longer bound. Nebuchadnezzar had built the image to declare the supremacy of Babylonian power and the gods that underwrote it. He had issued the decree to demonstrate that his authority was without limit or exception. He had heated the furnace 7 times hotter to prove that resistance was futile and that no god existed who could override his hand. He stood now before 3 men who smelled of nothing except the open air, and he said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." The most powerful king in the world had just confessed what the fire had demonstrated. There was a God his furnace could not touch. There were men whose God was more real to them than his threat had been. And the 4th figure walking in the fire, the one who looked like a son of the gods, present in the flames with 3 men who should not have survived them, had answered the king's earlier question more thoroughly than any argument could have. "What God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" This one. He promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that same day. The men who had refused to bow to his image now stood higher in his kingdom than they had before. The furnace that was meant to end them had instead declared them before the assembled officials of the entire Babylonian Empire as servants of the Most High God, a God who walks with his people in their fires and brings them through without the smell of smoke. To read the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with full understanding, you must first reckon with what Babylon was and what it had already done to these 3 men long before the music played on the plain of Dura. Nebuchadnezzar II came to power around 605 BC and spent the decades of his reign building the most formidable empire the ancient world had yet seen. His military campaigns were methodical and thorough. He did not merely defeat nations, he dismantled them, carrying away their treasuries, their temples, and most importantly, their brightest people. When he turned his attention to Judah, he took what every conqueror knows is the most valuable prize: the next generation. Young men from noble and royal families, among them Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were carried to Babylon, not as slaves, but as something more strategically useful. They would be educated in Babylonian language, literature, and customs. They would be absorbed into the machinery of the empire. They would become Babylonian, or as close to it as careful years of immersion could produce. The renaming was not incidental. In the ancient world, a name carried the weight of identity, lineage, and the gods a person belonged to. To rename a person was to make a claim on their soul. Hananiah became Shadrach. Mishael became Meshach. Azariah became Abednego. The Hebrew names that carried within them the syllables of the God of Israel were replaced with names that breathed the air of Babylonian religion. The empire was thorough in its intentions. What the empire could not do was reach the place where these men had already decided who they were and who they served. Some things cannot be renamed. The plain of Dura was chosen deliberately, broad and open, capable of holding the vast assembly Nebuchadnezzar required. Every significant official from every province of the empire was summoned: satraps and prefects, governors and advisors, treasurers and judges and magistrates. This was not a local ceremony. It was an imperial declaration, and the audience was the entire administrative body of the ancient world's greatest power. The golden image, standing 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, was built to a scale that communicated what words could not fully convey. In the ancient Near East, physical magnitude carried theological implication. The larger the image, the more overwhelming the divine claim it represented. Standing on the plain beneath it, a person was meant to feel the natural impulse to bow, the way a person feels small before a mountain. The image was an argument made in gold and height, and the argument was, there is nothing above this. The music served as the mechanism of compliance: horn and flute and zither and lyre, all instruments together, a coordinated sensory experience designed to move a diverse crowd of people toward a unified act. Music bypasses argument and reaches something more immediate in the human body. The sound rose across the plain, and the thousands fell, and in the falling was the declaration Nebuchadnezzar required: whatever language you speak, whatever people you come from, whatever gods you brought with you from your homeland, here, now, you are all Babylonians. The furnace was not a rumor or a distant threat. It was present, already burning, its heat visible and real. Such punishments were consistent with known practices in the region, where extreme measures served both as execution and as deterrent. The message being that the cost of resistance was not abstract, but immediate and total. Nebuchadnezzar had arranged the plain of Dura so that every person standing on it understood exactly what compliance meant and exactly what refusal cost. When the three men were brought before the king and given a final opportunity to comply, their answer contained something that deserves careful attention, not merely as a display of courage, but as a theological statement of extraordinary precision. They affirmed two things at once, and the two things held in tension reveal the full shape of genuine faith. The God we serve is able to deliver us. This was not performance. It was conviction rooted in the character of the God who had acted in history, who had parted seas and fed multitudes and spoken from mountains and kept covenant across generations. They were not summoning bravado from nowhere. They were standing on a foundation of what they knew about who God was. But even if He does not, here is where the statement becomes remarkable: we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. 4 words, even if He does not, that dismantle any transactional understanding of faith. They were not presenting their obedience as a claim against God's protection, as though faithfulness were a payment that guaranteed a specific outcome. They had separated their loyalty to God from the question of what God would do in the next few minutes. This is what the command to worship Yahweh alone had always meant at its deepest level. Not Yahweh when the outcome is favorable, not Yahweh when the cost is manageable, but Yahweh alone, regardless of what the plain of Dura held in the next hour. Their stance embodied what Scripture had long established, that obedience to God takes precedence over the commands of human rulers when those commands directly contradict divine law. They did not seek the confrontation. They had not marched to the plain intending to make a public stand. They had simply not bowed when everyone around them bowed. Faithfulness, in their case, was not a dramatic gesture, but the quiet continuation of who they already were. Nebuchadnezzar's astonishment when he looked into the furnace was not the astonishment of a man seeing something slightly unusual. It was the astonishment of a man whose entire framework for understanding the world was being overturned before his eyes. He had thrown 3 men into fire heated 7 times beyond its normal temperature, fire so extreme that the soldiers who carried them to the furnace door were killed by the heat before they could return. 3 men, bound, fell into those flames. 4 were walking in them. The king reached for the only language available to him, a polytheistic vocabulary that had no precise category for what he was seeing, and described the 4th figure as looking like a son of the gods. The description is imprecise because his framework was imprecise, but the observation was exact. Something was in the fire with these men that had no business being there by any natural accounting, and its presence was the reason they were walking rather than burning. Across the centuries, interpreters have understood this figure as either an angel sent by God or a pre-incarnate appearance of the Son of God himself, present in the fire with his servants before he took on flesh in Bethlehem. Either interpretation points to the same theological reality. God does not watch his faithful people suffer from a comfortable distance. He enters the suffering with them. He is personally present in the place that was meant to destroy them, and his presence transforms that place. Isaiah had promised exactly this to the exiled people of Israel. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Not a promise that the fire would not come. A promise about accompaniment, about who would be in it with them when it did. The completeness of their preservation confirmed what the 4th figure's presence had implied. Not a hair singed, not a robe scorched, not the smell of smoke. The fire had consumed the ropes that bound them, and nothing else, as though the flames knew precisely what they had been given permission to touch. Nebuchadnezzar's shift from rage to praise was not a soft conversion. It was the response of a man who respected power above all things, confronted with a demonstration of power that exceeded anything in his experience or his theology. He acknowledged publicly that no other God saves in this manner, issued a decree protecting the worship of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego throughout his empire, and promoted the 3 men in the province. The men who had refused him now stood higher in his kingdom than they had before. Their faithfulness, which had seemed to lead directly to their destruction, had become the instrument of their vindication before the assembled court of the ancient world's greatest empire. For the Jewish people enduring later persecutions, the original audience for whom the book of Daniel was preserved and read, this story carried a word that required no elaboration. God's kingdom prevails over every empire that has ever demanded what belongs to him alone. His servants are not abandoned in their fires. Faithfulness in exile is not invisible or wasted. It is accompanied, preserved, and sometimes, in ways that leave kings on their feet in astonishment, declared before the watching eyes of the whole world. The knowledge of God's name went further, because 3 men would not bow. The empire that had tried to rename them ended up proclaiming the name of their God across its provinces. Some things cannot be renamed, and some fires cannot destroy what God has chosen to preserve. The steadiness Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego displayed on the plain of Dura did not appear from nowhere. It had been forming for years, quietly, without audience, in choices that seemed small at the time and carried no particular drama. When they first arrived in Babylon as young men displaced from everything familiar, the earliest recorded test was not a golden image or a blazing furnace. It was food. The king's table offered provisions that violated their faith, and rather than accept the compromise their circumstances appeared to justify, they asked for something different. It was a private refusal, witnessed by no crowd, generating no crisis. But it was the same refusal, in miniature, that they would make on the plain of Dura. The choice to let what they believed about God shape their behavior, rather than letting circumstance shape it for them. This is how genuine conviction is formed, not in the dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones. Psychologists who study moral courage consistently find that people who hold firm under extreme pressure are rarely simply braver than others by nature. They hold firm because they have been practicing holding firm. In low-stakes situations, in private, when no one was watching, until faithful response became less a deliberate decision and more the natural expression of who they had become. By the time the music rose over the plain of Dura, these three men had already answered the essential question many times in smaller rooms. The great crisis did not form their character. It revealed what had already been forming for years in the quiet faithfulness of exile. When they stood before Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful king in the world, a furnace already burning beside him, their response carried a quality that is easy to read past. It was calm. They offered no elaborate argument. They did not plead or negotiate or remind him of their years of faithful service. They simply told him what was true. God is able to deliver us. But even if he does not, we will not bow. This reflects what psychologists describe as a secure internal framework, a stable foundation of identity that does not depend on external circumstances for its maintenance. People whose sense of self is primarily built from external sources, approval, safety, the goodwill of those in authority, are highly vulnerable when those sources are threatened. But people whose identity is rooted in something external circumstances cannot reach carry a different steadiness into difficult moments. The threat is real and acknowledged without becoming disorienting, because what it is aimed at, their physical safety, is held with open hands, while what it cannot touch, their covenant with God, is held with everything they have. The phrase, "even if he does not," is the most psychologically significant statement in the entire account. It demonstrates mature acceptance of uncertainty, the capacity to hold an unknown outcome without being destabilized by not knowing it. They were not trusting the outcome. They were trusting the character of the one who held it. And that trust was steady, whether deliverance came or not. Every element of the dedication ceremony was engineered to activate the deep human instinct toward conformity. The music created a shared sensory experience that moved the crowd through feeling rather than reasoning. The simultaneous bowing of thousands produced an overwhelming social reality. The visible furnace made threat physical and immediate, and the king's direct personal challenge added the most potent pressure of all, the focused displeasure of the highest authority in the known world delivered face to face. Social psychology has documented extensively how powerful these conditions are. People with strong prior convictions have capitulated under far less, not because they stopped believing what they believed, but because accumulated pressure overwhelmed the internal voice of conviction in real time. What gave the three men resources to resist was two things working together: deeply internalized prior commitment and the presence of each other. They did not face this moment alone. Each could see the other's standing. Each could hear the other's answer. Shared conviction provides something individual conviction cannot always sustain: the visible embodiment of the choice in another person beside you. Isolation is among the most effective tools of those who compel conformity. Community is among the most powerful resources of those who resist it. The psychological steadiness these three men displayed did not come from unusual temperament or exceptional natural courage. It came from the long alignment between what they believed and how they had been living. Conviction practiced into the grain of daily life until faithful response became the natural direction of their character. Their story asks a searching question of anyone who reads it. What small choices are you making today that will determine who you are when the larger moment arrives? The conviction that holds in the furnace is built at the ordinary table. The faith that stands firm under public pressure is formed in the quiet, repeated choices that precede the crisis by months and years. The peace that walks in the fire is cultivated in the practices of trust and devotion that run all the way back to the beginning of a life oriented toward God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not extraordinary men who faced an extraordinary test. They were ordinary men who had been faithfully preparing, in food, in prayer, in daily devotion, in the small and unheroic choices of life in exile, for a test they did not know was coming. When it came, they were ready, not because the fire was not real, but because their God was more real than the fire. The moment Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained standing while 10,000 officials knelt, everything that followed became inevitable. They had not sought confrontation. They had simply not bowed. But in an empire built on unified allegiance, not bowing was its own declaration, and declarations have consequences. The consequences arrived swiftly. First came the accusation. The astrologers who reported them did so with the efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, naming them specifically, framing their refusal as royal betrayal, noting that these were men the king himself had elevated. The accusation landed with force precisely because it was true. There was no misunderstanding to clarify. They had stood when everyone else knelt, and the entire assembled court had seen it. Then came the king's rage. Nebuchadnezzar was a man whose commands had reshaped the ancient world, and he had just been publicly refused by 3 administrators he had personally promoted. His fury was immediate and personal, already filling the room before a single word was exchanged. What followed was not symbolic. It was immediate, physical, and lethal. Soldiers bound them tightly in all their clothing, robes, trousers, turbans, everything they were wearing. The binding was both practical and humiliating, the treatment of men being prepared for execution. They were led to the mouth of the furnace fully clothed and fully bound, stripped of any ability to move or shield themselves from what was coming. The furnace had been heated 7 times beyond its ordinary temperature, not a standard execution, but the expression of a king's rage translated into fire. The heat at the opening was so extreme that the soldiers who carried the 3 men there died before they could return. Strong soldiers, chosen specifically for this task, killed by proximity to what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into. They fell into those flames bound and unable to protect themselves. This was an instrument of execution designed to be inescapable, and it had already demonstrated its lethal capacity on the men who brought them to its edge. Beyond the physical terror, there was everything else their refusal had cost. Their positions in the provincial administration, built over years of faithful service, were forfeit the moment they did not kneel. Their safety, maintained through careful navigation of life in a foreign court, was gone. Whatever future they had imagined in Babylon, whatever modest stability exile had allowed them to build, ended on the plain of Dura when the music played and they remained standing. Their stand also cast a shadow over people beyond themselves. The wider Jewish community in exile watched with the knowledge that Nebuchadnezzar's punishments frequently extended beyond the individuals directly involved. Their courage placed others in the radius of potential danger. And then there were the soldiers, unnamed men, carrying out an order they had no authority to refuse, killed by the heat of a furnace they were commanded to approach. Their deaths belonged to the full weight of the day, unintended and yet real. It would diminish their testimony to soften what they faced or to move too quickly toward the miracle. The furnace was real. The binding was real. The deaths of the soldiers were real. The loss of everything they had built was real. Faithfulness does not always prevent suffering. It did not prevent theirs. Conviction that costs nothing proves nothing. The testimony of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego carries its weight precisely because the danger was total, the cost was genuine, and they stood anyway, not because they were certain of the outcome, but because they were certain of their God. That certainty, held at full cost, is what the furnace displayed to the watching empire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego entered the furnace bound and fell into the flames without the ability to move or protect themselves. They emerged walking freely, unharmed, carrying no evidence that the fire had touched them. The ropes burned. Nothing else did. That detail is worth pausing over. The flames were precise in what they consumed. The thing that restricted and bound was gone, while the men themselves stood untouched. What had been thrown in as an execution became something else entirely, a place of release. The bonds that the king's soldiers had tied tightly in all their clothing were removed not by human hands, but by the fire itself, and the men who fell in helpless emerged walking freely in the presence of a fourth figure who had not been there when they were thrown. Their faith had been declared before the king in words. It was confirmed in the furnace in reality. There is a difference between trusting God in the anticipation of suffering and knowing His presence in the middle of it. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego crossed that threshold in the flames. What they had believed became what they had experienced, and no subsequent pressure or argument could reach the place where that knowledge now lived. The trial did not merely test their faith, it deepened it into something that first-hand encounter alone can produce. Nebuchadnezzar entered the day as a ruler whose rage had heated a furnace 7 times beyond its ordinary temperature and killed his own soldiers in its expression. He ended it on his feet, approaching the furnace opening, calling out to 3 men he had just tried to execute as servants of the Most High God. The transformation in the king was public and complete. The man who had demanded universal worship and threatened death for refusal now issued a decree protecting the worship of the God of Israel, and declared before the assembled court of his empire that no other God could save in the same manner. He had built a golden image to enforce unified allegiance across every nation and language in his kingdom. He now acknowledged, in the same public setting, the supremacy of the God he had never intended to honor. This shift was not merely personal. It altered the atmosphere for Jewish exiles throughout the province. The king's proclamation provided formal protection for those who worshipped the God of Israel and elevated the 3 men who had refused to abandon him. What had begun as a moment of maximum danger for the Jewish community in Babylon ended as a moment of expanded safety and influence. The 3 men received promotion in the province following their deliverance. Their faithfulness, rather than costing them their positions, ultimately increased their influence and responsibility. The public nature of the event ensured that the testimony traveled. Every official who had witnessed the dedication on the plain of Dura carried the account back to their own provinces. The story became part of the collective memory of the empire. For the wider Jewish community in exile, the account established something essential: that God was present and active within the empire that held them captive, that faithfulness was not wasted even in Babylon, and that those who trusted him were not ultimately at the mercy of those who threatened them. The furnace that was intended as the final word on what happened to those who refused Nebuchadnezzar became instead the place where God spoke most clearly, not in words, but in the walking of 4 figures through fire, and in 3 men who emerged into the morning air without the smell of smoke, carrying a testimony that the most powerful empire in the world could neither manufacture nor silence. The most important preparation for any crisis happens long before the crisis arrives. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had already decided who they were and what they would not compromise before the music played on the plain of Dura. That decision, made quietly in ordinary time, was what held them when everything became extraordinary. Begin there. Take time now, in a calm and unrushed moment, to identify your non-negotiables. Write them down or speak them aloud. Base them in scripture rather than feeling, because feelings shift under pressure, and written convictions do not. Know in advance what you will not do, what you will not say, what you will not watch or pursue or become, so that when the moment of testing arrives, you are not making the decision for the first time under duress. Then practice in the small things. Refuse compromise in your thought life, your speech, your use of time, your private habits. The furnace-level faithfulness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego grew from the table-level faithfulness of their daily diet in Babylon. Large stands are almost always natural extensions of small ones. Build the habit of choosing God's way when the cost is low, and you will find it more available to you when the cost is high. When testing comes, and it will come in forms both dramatic and ordinary, preparation determines response. The three men gave a calm, clear, respectful answer to the most powerful king in the world because they had already settled the question before he asked it. Practice speaking truth with both gentleness and firmness. Know what you will say before you are asked to say it, so fear does not produce hesitation or unnecessary offense. Cultivate the even-if posture. Trust that God is able to deliver while holding the outcome with open hands. Pray specifically and honestly for rescue, then submit to whatever God allows. This combination, confident prayer and open-handed trust, is what reduces anxiety when results remain uncertain. It is not resignation. It is the mature faith of people who know God's character well enough to trust Him when His answer takes a form they did not choose. Guard your environment deliberately. Limit sustained exposure to influences that weaken resolve. Replace draining patterns with regular time in Scripture and prayer that reinforce who you are and whose you are. When failure occurs, and it will, confess quickly and return. God's mercy meets honest repentance. Do not remain in shame longer than it takes to bring it honestly to God. Receive forgiveness and move forward. When deliverance comes, live openly. The testimony of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego spread through an empire because their story was public and undeniable. Share what God has done with gentleness and without exaggeration, so others facing their own furnaces are encouraged by what you have walked through. Teach these principles to those coming behind you, children, younger believers, anyone you have influence with. Courage is not sudden heroism. It is daily faithfulness accumulated over time, and it can be modeled and passed on. End each day with reflection and gratitude. Thank God for His presence in every furnace you have already survived. This practice builds the quiet confidence that carries you into tomorrow. The deep, settled knowledge that the God who walked with three men in the fire walks with you in every trial you will ever face. As this time with the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego draws to a gentle close, let the truth settle quietly in your heart. Three young men stood when everyone else knelt. They spoke with calm conviction before a furious king. They walked through flames that killed others and emerged completely unharmed. Their God was with them in the fire, and He brought them out in victory. The same God who saw their stand sees every choice you make. He knows the pressures you face. He understands the cost of standing firm. Whether your furnace involves relationships, work, fear, doubt, or any hidden battle, His presence remains constant. He is able to deliver. He is worthy of trust even when the outcome stays unknown. Carry this quiet confidence with you. Make daily choices that honor him. Stand with courage when the moment requires it. Rest in the assurance that no fire can separate you from his love and care. The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is faithful. He will walk with you through every trial. May his peace fill your mind and heart as you rest tonight. Sleep deeply in the knowledge that you are held, protected, and deeply loved. Tomorrow offers fresh strength to live with the same faithfulness these three men displayed. Go in peace. Amen.